The first thing Margaret noticed was the smell. Not dust, not the ordinary, forgivable mustiness of a house that had been locked up for 40 years. Something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like dried flowers pressed between the pages of a book that nobody had opened since before she was born. She stood at the top of the attic stairs with a torch in one hand and a list in the other. Her mother's handwriting, neat and precise even in its final weeks, itemizing what was to be kept and what was to be given away and what was simply to be thrown out. The list said nothing about a smell. The list said nothing about the locked iron chest in the far corner beneath the water tank, which Margaret had never noticed in 38 years of occasional visits to this attic, and which she could not explain now, and which was, for reasons she could not quite articulate even to herself, the first thing she walked toward. The key was taped to the underside of the lid, as though someone had wanted it to be found, but not too easily. Margaret Calloway had flown from Boston to Edinburgh 4 days after her mother's funeral. Not because there was urgency, but because the alternative was sitting in her apartment in the South End, staring at her phone and waiting for grief to organize itself into something manageable. It had not done that. Grief, she was learning at the age of 51, does not organize itself. It arrives when it chooses and in whatever form it chooses, and the best you can do is remain upright. Her mother, Dorothy Calloway, had been 82 years old and had lived in the same house on Morningside Drive in Edinburgh for the last 40 years of her life. Before that, she had been Margaret's mother in a house in Connecticut, which Margaret had grown up in and which had been sold when Dorothy moved to Scotland after the divorce. That had been 1987. Margaret had been 17. She had not understood at 17 why her mother had chosen Edinburgh specifically. Of all the places in the world a newly divorced woman might choose to rebuild a life. She had not asked. You did not ask Dorothy Calloway things she did not volunteer. That had been the primary lesson of growing up in her household. Now Dorothy was dead, and the house on Morningside Drive had to be cleared, and Margaret was the only one to do it. Her brother James lived in Vancouver and had sent a card that said he would come if needed. Margaret had not told him he was needed because she was not sure he was. James had his own complicated relationship with their mother, one that had been resolved, or at least settled, into a polite annual phone call and the occasional visit. Margaret's relationship with Dorothy had been warmer than that, and more difficult for the same reasons that warm relationships are always more difficult. There was more at stake. She had expected the attic to take an afternoon. She had expected boxes of old clothes, stacks of magazines, perhaps some of her own childhood things that had migrated north when the Connecticut house was sold. She had expected, in short, the ordinary archaeology of a long life. She had not expected the chest. The lock was stiff, but it opened on the second attempt. Inside, packed carefully in tissue paper that had yellowed to the color of old cream, were 4 things. A bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon the color of dried blood, a photograph, a small package wrapped in brown paper and twine, and a diary. The diary was leather-bound, dark green, the leather cracked at the spine and the edges worn to the pale color of old bone. On the front, pressed into the leather in faded gold, were initials, E.M.H. Margaret's mother's name had been Dorothy Ann Calloway. Before her marriage, Dorothy Ann Walsh. Neither set of initials matched. She sat down on the attic floor, cross-legged in the dust, and opened the diary. The first entry was dated the 14th of March, 1943. The handwriting was small and careful, the ink brown with age but still entirely legible. The voice it belonged to was immediately present, not the distant formal register of old documents, but something alive and quick and unmistakably young. Whoever had written this had been, Margaret guessed from the cadence and the concerns and the specific quality of the anxiety, no older than 20. I have decided to write everything down, the first entry began. Not because I expect anyone to read it, because if I do not write it down, I will go mad with the weight of it, and I cannot afford to go mad. There is too much left to do and too many people depending on me being ordinary. Margaret read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then she turned the page. The diary belonged to a woman who called herself Elsa. She did not give her surname in the early pages. She called herself simply Elsa, or I, or occasionally we, in ways that were initially mysterious. She was writing from somewhere in southern England. She never named the town, and Margaret would later understand that this was deliberate. During the 2nd year of the Second World War, she worked in a function she described only obliquely. The work, she called it, or the office. And there was in her references to it a careful vagueness that Margaret, who had spent 20 years as a corporate lawyer, recognized as the vagueness of someone trained never to be specific. But the diary was not, primarily, about the work. The diary was about a man. He appeared in the 4th entry, written on a Tuesday in April 1943, without preamble or introduction, as though Elsa had been thinking about him for so long that explaining who he was felt unnecessary. Saw W again at the briefing this morning. He looked tired. I wanted to say something, but there is never the right moment, and besides, I don't know what I would say. That I understand? That I am afraid too? None of it sounds like enough. Margaret read the entry twice and felt, with a certainty she could not explain, that she was holding something she was not supposed to find. She read for 2 hours on the attic floor while the Edinburgh afternoon light changed from gray to darker gray, and the house settled around her with its ordinary sounds. She read through March and April and into May of 1943, through the entries about the work and the fear and the specific, carefully managed anxiety of someone doing something dangerous in a time when doing dangerous things was the only reasonable response to the world as it was. She read about W, whose full name Elsa never used, who appeared in the diary as a presence rather than a person, assembled across dozens of small observations. The way he held a pencil, the specific quality of his laugh, a scar on his left hand that he had deflected a question about once and never mentioned again. She read until she reached the entry dated the 22nd of June, 1943, and then she stopped. The entry was only 4 lines, but 4 lines were enough. I have told no one. There is no one I could tell. W does not know. He cannot know. It would change everything for him, and he has enough to carry. I have thought carefully about what to do, and I have decided. I will go to my aunt in Edinburgh. The child will be born there. After that, I don't know, but it will be born. Margaret sat very still in the attic dust. She picked up the photograph that had been in the chest beneath the diary. It was a black and white photograph of a young woman, perhaps 20, in a coat with a wide collar. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at something slightly to the left, and her expression was unreadable. Not quite sad, not quite resolved, but something in between. On the back of the photograph, in the same careful handwriting as the diary, 2 words. For Dorothy. Margaret's mother's name. Written on the back of a photograph of a woman who was not her mother. In a chest that had been locked in her mother's attic for an unknown number of decades. She looked at the photograph for a long time, and then she looked at the initials on the diary, E.M.H., and understood, with the slow, vertiginous clarity of a conclusion that had been waiting at the edge of her comprehension for 2 hours, what those initials almost certainly meant. Her mother had not been Dorothy Ann Walsh, or rather, Walsh had not been her mother's birth name, which meant that everything Margaret thought she knew about where she came from had just been made uncertain by 4 lines in an 80-year-old diary found in a locked chest in an Edinburgh attic on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. She sat in the dust and listened to the house settle around her, and then she opened the bundle of letters. The letters were not from W. They were addressed to a woman named Elsa. They were signed, "Your daughter, Dorothy." The estate agent had given her 2 weeks to clear the house. 2 weeks felt like an insult, and also, she suspected, like more than enough time. Her mother had not been a keeper of things. The house in Connecticut, when Dorothy had left it, had been stripped of everything personal within a week. The Edinburgh house had had 40 years to accumulate, but Dorothy had also had 40 years to quietly decide what was worth accumulating. Margaret did not expect to find much that surprised her. She had expected to feel nothing in particular about clearing the house. She had told herself on the flight over that she was coming to do a practical thing, an inventory, a series of decisions, the physical work of dismantling a life's accumulation into categories. She had approached grief in this way before, as a logistical problem to be managed, and it had worked well enough. She was aware that this approach had a name in the therapeutic literature, and that the name was not entirely flattering, and she did not care. It got things done. The house had defeated the approach within an hour. There was too much of her mother in every room. In the kitchen, the specific angle of the afternoon light through the east window, the window Dorothy had always insisted on keeping clean, even when she could not do it herself. In the sitting room, the reading chair with the lamp positioned exactly right for left-handed readers, which was how Dorothy had read for 80 years. In the hallway, the coat hooks at a height slightly lower than standard, because Dorothy had been 5'2" and had never seen any reason to accommodate a world designed for taller people. She sat in the attic for a long time after reading the last letter. The Edinburgh light had gone almost entirely now. The gray deepened to near dark, and she had not turned on any additional light because the torch was where she had set it down when she opened the chest, and she had not thought to pick it up again. She sat in the near dark with the letters in her lap and the diary on the floor beside her and the notebook in her hands, and she tried to feel the full shape of what she had learned. Her mother had known Elsa was here, had known it since 1963, had written to her for 22 years, and then had moved here, to this city, to this street, to a house that Margaret had always assumed was chosen for its light, or its cost, or some practical quality she had never thought to question. Her mother had chosen Edinburgh because Elsa was in Edinburgh, had spent the last 28 years of her life in the same city as the woman who had given her away, had perhaps walked past her grandmother's house on an ordinary Tuesday, had perhaps sat in the same cafe, had perhaps seen the same sky. Whether they had met in those final years, Margaret did not know. The letters ended in 1985. Elsa had died. Margaret realized she did not know when Elsa had died, or where, or whether her mother had been present for it. There were more things she did not know than she had believed possible 4 hours ago. She had grown up in Edinburgh's orbit without knowing it was her grandmother's city. She had visited her mother in this house on school holidays and then on adult visits, had walked these streets, had perhaps stood at a bus stop beside an elderly woman with careful handwriting and no idea who that woman was to her. The proximity had been real. The connection had been hidden. And Dorothy had carried that hidden connection for the last 28 years of her life with the same quiet efficiency with which she had carried everything else. Margaret was learning, in the attic dark, that the woman she had thought she knew completely had been significantly larger than the version available to her. The letters were not what Margaret expected. She had expected, in the half-formed instinctive way that we expect things before we have any real information to expect them from, that they would be formal, distant, the correspondence of two people who had found each other late and did not quite know how to be in contact after the long gap between them. Letters full of careful pleasantries and the polite, bounded language of people who have a great deal to say and have decided not to say most of it. The letters were not that. The letters were furious. There were 11 of them. They spanned 22 years, from 1963 to 1985. The handwriting in the early ones was her mother's, unmistakably, the same neat, precise hand Margaret had grown up reading on birthday cards and grocery lists, and, in the difficult years of her adolescence, the notes her mother left when she did not want to have a conversation in person. The handwriting changed across the years, softened in the later letters, became looser and more urgent, as though by 1985, Dorothy Walsh had stopped editing herself before she wrote. The first letter, dated October 1963, began without greeting. I know what you did. I have known for 3 years, and I have not written because I did not think I could do it without saying something I could not take back. I find now that I cannot take anything back anyway, so I may as well say it. Margaret read it twice, 3 times, her lawyer's mind moving through it for the structure beneath the emotion. There was something her mother had discovered in 1960. There was something that had been done to her. There was a woman named Elsa who had done it, or at least been party to it, and toward whom Margaret's mother directed, across the span of 11 letters over 22 years, a grief that slowly and imperfectly transformed itself into something that was not quite forgiveness, but was adjacent to it. Margaret set the first letter down carefully and picked up the second. The second letter was dated 1967. It was longer and less raw than the first, with more room for explanation and question. From it, Margaret extracted the following. Dorothy had been told, as a child, that she was the daughter of a man named Robert Walsh and a woman named Catherine Walsh, who had died in childbirth in 1942. This was the story she had grown up with, in the house of Robert Walsh's sister, who had raised her as her own after Robert Walsh himself had died in 1944, somewhere in France, in the final months of the war. In 1960, clearing out the Walsh aunt's house after her death, Dorothy had found a letter, a single letter, addressed to her, that the aunt had kept unopened for 18 years. In the letter, the truth. Her mother had not died in childbirth. Her father had not been Robert Walsh. Her mother's name was Elsa Margaret Hartley, E.M.H., and she was alive, and had been alive all of Dorothy's life, and had known where Dorothy was, and had stayed away because she had believed, in the desperate arithmetic of 1942, that staying away was what love required. Dorothy had found Elsa in Edinburgh in 1963, had knocked on the door of the house on Morningside Drive, the same house that Margaret had just spent 4 days clearing, and had been admitted, and had sat across a kitchen table from the woman who was her mother, and had said, according to the letter, "You gave me away. I need you to tell me why." Margaret stood up from the attic floor because her legs had gone to sleep. She walked around the attic's perimeter in the dim light, the letters in her hand, her mind moving through the architecture of what she was learning. Her grandmother. The woman who had written the diary was her grandmother, Elsa Margaret Hartley, born sometime around 1923, who had done something secret during the Second World War and had become pregnant by a man whose name she never wrote in full, and who had made the agonizing decision to give the child to a family who could raise her in safety and stability and the ordinary light of a life that was not organized around secrets. Her mother had known this, had known it since 1963, had spent 22 years in correspondence with Elsa, the correspondence that Margaret was holding in her hands, a correspondence that had moved through fury and grief and recrimination and long silence and slow, imperfect, incomplete reconciliation. Her mother had moved to Edinburgh in 1987, the year after her divorce from Margaret's father, the year Margaret was 17. She had not explained why Edinburgh. She had not said, "Because my mother is here." She had not said, "Because I spent 22 years writing to a woman in this city, and I have decided, at 52, to finally be in the same place as her." She had simply moved, and when Margaret had asked why Edinburgh, she had said, "I like the light." Margaret had believed her. Because you believed Dorothy Walsh when she said things like that, in a certain tone, with a certain finality. You did not push. She should have pushed. The later letters were different in texture. By the mid-70s, the anger in her mother's writing had begun to give way to something more complicated. Questions mainly. Not the accusatory questions of the early letters, but the questions of someone trying to understand a decision made before she was born, from inside a context she had not lived in and could not fully imagine. "I have been trying to understand 1942, Dorothy wrote in 1974. Not to excuse it. I want to be clear about that. I am not trying to excuse anything. I am trying to understand the geography of it, what the options were, what you thought you were protecting me from, and what you thought you were protecting yourself from, and whether those two things were the same." Elsa's replies were not in the bundle. Margaret had only her mother's side of the correspondence, only Dorothy's voice, moving across 22 years toward a woman who had remained, in these letters, a silence into which Dorothy poured questions. The last letter was dated March 1985. It was 3 pages long. It ended, "I don't know if I will keep writing. I don't know if there is more to say. What I know is that I understand more than I did, and less than I wanted to, and that somewhere in that gap I have found something that might be peace, or might just be exhaustion. Either way, I can live with it. I think you can too." Margaret doesn't know any of this. I have decided not to tell her. I'm not sure I'll ever be sure that's the right decision, but it's the one I'm making. Margaret read her own name in her mother's handwriting. I have decided not to tell her. She sat down on an old trunk and held the letter in both hands and felt, with great clarity, 3 things simultaneously: grief for her mother, anger at her mother, and a love for her mother so deep and complicated that there was no word in any language she knew that would fit it. And then she picked up the brown paper package that she had not yet opened. Inside the package, wrapped in the same tissue paper as the diary, was a small notebook. Not Elsa's. Different handwriting, a different generation of paper, newer. Inside the front cover, in her mother's handwriting, "For Margaret, when the time is right. I'm sorry I couldn't do this face to face. I wasn't brave enough. Maybe you'll be braver than me." The notebook contained a name, an address, and a date. The name was Thomas Hartley. The address was in London. The date, written in her mother's careful hand next to the name, was a birth year, 1944. Margaret stared at the notebook for a very long time. W, the man in the diary, the man whose full name Elsa had never written. He had not known about the child. Elsa had been certain of that, had written it explicitly in the diary. He cannot know. It would change everything for him. Except, the child had been born in 1942. Dorothy had been born in 1942. The notebook said Thomas Hartley had been born in 1944, which meant there had been a second child, which meant Margaret's mother had a brother she had never known about, which meant that somewhere in London there was a man in his 80s named Thomas Hartley who almost certainly did not know that Dorothy Walsh had ever existed. Margaret sat in the attic of her dead mother's house and looked at the name and the address and the date, and understood, with the sudden, specific clarity of someone who has just seen the last piece of a puzzle fall into place, why her mother had taped the key to the underside of the lid. She had meant for this to be found. She had meant for Margaret to find it. The question was, had Dorothy ever contacted Thomas Hartley herself? And why was the address in the notebook written in a different ink, newer, bluer than the rest of the page? She flew to London on a Saturday morning. She had not called ahead. She had thought about it, had sat in her mother's kitchen the night before with the notebook open on the table and her phone in her hand, trying to compose a message to a stranger that began with the words, "You don't know me, but I have reason to believe you are my mother's brother." She had deleted it 4 times. The problem was not the words. The problem was that she did not know, yet, what she was offering. Whether she was delivering news or asking a question. Whether she was looking for confirmation of something she already believed, or for contradiction of it, or for something else entirely that she did not yet have a name for. She had decided to go in person, because some things should not be done by text message, because her mother, whatever else she had been, had always met difficult things face to face, and Margaret was her mother's daughter, and this seemed like the right inheritance to claim. The address in the notebook was in Pimlico, in a quiet street of white stucco terraces with iron railings and window boxes that still held the dried stalks of last summer's flowers. The house was number 47. The bell was answered after a long wait by a woman in her 60s, carefully dressed, with an expression of polite inquiry that shifted, almost imperceptibly, when she looked at Margaret's face. The shift was so small that Margaret almost missed it. Almost. "I'm looking for Thomas Hartley," Margaret said. The woman said, "Would you like to come in?" It was not a question. His name was Thomas Hartley, and he was 80 years old, and he had the eyes of Elsa's photograph. Not the color. The photograph was black and white. She had no way of knowing the color, but the particular quality of them. The attention, the watchfulness, the capacity for looking at something directly without flinching away. He was thin and very upright, and he sat in an armchair by the window of a sitting room full of books. And he looked at Margaret for a long moment before he spoke. "You look like her," he said. Margaret's heart stopped. "Like who?" she said. "Like Dorothy." He said her mother's name with a specific care, the way you say the name of someone you have been carrying for a long time without a context for them. "You're her daughter, Margaret." Not a question. She said, "You knew." "She wrote to me," he said, 3 years ago, out of nowhere. A letter. She told me everything. His wife, Eleanor, brought tea. She had the composed, careful manner of a woman who has known a secret for 3 years and has been waiting for the person it belongs to arrive. She set the tea down and touched her husband's shoulder and left them alone. And Margaret sat in the chair across from Thomas Hartley and learned the things her mother had decided not to tell her in person, but had made certain she would find eventually. Thomas had been born in Edinburgh in 1944. He had been adopted at 6 months old by a couple named Hartley from London, who had been told only that his mother was a young woman unable to care for him, and who had raised him with love and without questions in a house in Pimlico that had been, by coincidence or intention, the same house he still lived in 80 years later. He had been, by his own account, happy. The adoption had been complete and clean, and the Hartleys had been good people, and he had never had cause, or the desire, to look further back than them. Until Dorothy's letter. "She sent me Elsa's diary," he said. "A copy of it. She must have had it copied at some point before she died. She sent me the diary, and she told me about the letters, the ones she'd written to Elsa across those years. And she said she was sorry she hadn't reached out sooner, but she hadn't known how. And then she said," he paused and looked at his hands, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. "She said, 'You had a sister. Her name was Dorothy. She died in January, and you will never get to meet her, and I'm sorry for that too.'" Margaret realized, slowly, that she was crying. Not dramatically. She had not, even as a child, cried dramatically, but steadily, in the way of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down. "She knew she was dying," Margaret said. "Yes," Thomas said. "From the letter, I think she had known for several months. She said she had wanted to meet me in person, but she'd run out of time. She said she hoped this was enough. Knowing. She said she hoped it was better than not knowing." Margaret thought about her mother writing that letter, dying, and writing a letter to a stranger who was her brother, and arranging for her daughter to find a locked chest in an attic with a key taped to the underside of the lid, making sure, in the careful, precise, organized way that had been the hallmark of Dorothy Walsh's entire life, that the connections would be made after she was gone, since she had not been able to make them while she was living. It was, Margaret thought, the most Dorothy thing she had ever heard. She told him about Dorothy, about the house in Connecticut and the house in Edinburgh, and the precise, intelligent, occasionally infuriating woman who had raised her, and who had kept this secret for 40 years because she had decided that keeping it was what love required, which was exactly what Elsa had decided 80 years before her, and which was a decision that Margaret was not, even now, sure she agreed with, but which she was beginning to understand. She told him about the diary and about W, and they read through the entries together. Thomas, slowly and carefully, his expression changing as he moved through them. She loved him, he said. Very much, Margaret said. I think it's the clearest thing in the whole diary. Do you think he ever knew about us? About either of us? Margaret thought about this carefully. She had been thinking about it since the attic, turning it over the way she turned over difficult cases, looking for what the evidence supported and what it didn't. I think Elsa made sure he didn't, she said. At least not at the time. Whatever the work was, whatever they were doing together in 1943, she believed that knowing would have put him in danger or destroyed his ability to keep doing it. She was protecting him the only way available to her. She was protecting everyone, Thomas said quietly, and losing everything in the process. Margaret did not say anything. There was nothing to say. It was simply true. She stayed in London until Monday. She slept in the spare room of the Pimlico house and lay awake the first night in the particular quiet of someone else's home, listening to the sounds of the street outside, thinking about women who make impossible decisions in impossible times, and the long, uneven consequences of those decisions across the decades that follow. She thought about Elsa, about what it had cost her to give Dorothy away, and then to give Thomas away, and then to sit in the house on Morningside Drive for decades, aging, as her daughter wrote her furious, and then inquiring, and then gradually softening letters from Connecticut, and then from Edinburgh. To have Dorothy finally arrive at Morningside Drive in 1987, not as a stranger, but as a woman she had been corresponding with for 24 years. To share a city with her daughter for the last years of both their lives, without Margaret ever knowing that the woman on Morningside Drive was not simply her mother, but the end of a story that had begun in a wartime office in southern England when Elsa was 20 years old and in love. On Monday morning, before she went to the station, she sat with Thomas in the kitchen of the Pimlico house, and they drank coffee, and the conversation was quiet and companionable in the way the conversations sometimes become when two people have said the important things and are no longer required to say anything else. What do you want to do with this? Thomas asked. It was a good question. She had been turning it over since Edinburgh. I want to know who W was, she said. I think I want to know if he knew. Not because it changes anything, but because the diary makes him real. And if he was real, and if he didn't know, then there's a part of Elsa's story that never got resolved. And if he did know, Thomas said, then there's a different part of the story that never got resolved. Thomas nodded slowly. He looked out the kitchen window at the Pimlico street, at the iron railings and the dried flower stalks in the window boxes and the ordinary, unhurried life of a London morning. My daughter lives in Edinburgh, he said. She'd like to meet you, if you're willing. I'd like that, Margaret said, and she meant it. She took the train back to Edinburgh, and on the train she opened her laptop and began to search. W, the diary, the work, Southern England, 1943. The language Elsa had used was careful but not impenetrable, and Margaret had spent 20 years learning to find the relevant fact inside the careful language, and she had 4 hours on the train and the particular, focused energy of someone who has just found out that the story of her own life is significantly larger than she had believed. She found him before York. His name had been William Edmund Calder. He had been a signals analyst attached to a unit in Buckinghamshire that Margaret did not need to look up, because anyone who had ever read about the Second World War in any detail knew what was done in Buckinghamshire in 1943 and what it had cost the people who did it. William Calder had survived the war. He had married in 1947. He had died in 1998 at the age of 79 in a hospice in Oxford, survived by his wife and 3 children. Margaret closed the laptop and looked out the train window at the darkening English countryside and thought about Elsa writing in her diary. He cannot know. It would change everything for him. And he had not known. And it had not changed anything for him. And he had lived a full life and died peacefully, and had never known that the young woman he had loved in 1943 had carried 2 of his children into a world that was trying in every direction to destroy itself. The train crossed into Scotland. The landscape changed to the wide, spare, particular beauty of the southern uplands in late afternoon. Margaret watched it and thought about what she was going to do next, which was call James in Vancouver and tell him all of it, because James deserved to know, and then meet Thomas's daughter in Edinburgh, who was her cousin and who she had not known existed until 4 days ago, and then do whatever came after that, which she did not yet know, but which she was, for the first time in this trip, not afraid of. She had come to Edinburgh to clear a house. She was leaving with a family she had not known she had. Her mother had done that, had organized it carefully, had taped the key to the underside of the lid, had written in a notebook in 2 different inks because she had found Thomas's address years after she had written the note, had updated it, had put it back, had believed that her daughter would find it and know what to do with it. Dorothy Walsh had not been brave enough to do it face to face. She had been brave enough to make sure it got done. That, Margaret thought, as the train moved north through the fading light, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.